For centuries, the continent of Europe was the undisputed, absolute center of the civilized global order, radiating immense power across the oceans. It was a continent of sprawling, ancient empires that commanded the oceans, dictated global trade, and aggressively conquered vast, distant territories. By the dawn of the 20th century, European powers directly controlled nearly 80% of the Earth's entire landmass and population. From the bustling streets of London to the grand palaces of Vienna, European capitals radiated absolute, unquestioned, and seemingly eternal imperial authority. This unprecedented global dominance was built on superior industrial technology, ruthless military discipline, and incredibly complex financial networks. European leaders possessed a supreme, almost divine sense of cultural superiority and believed their global hegemony was a permanent law of nature. The glittering metropolises of Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg were monuments to a civilization that believed it had definitively conquered history. They extracted immeasurable wealth from their distant colonies, funneling rubber, gold, cotton, and oil directly into the insatiable European industrial machine. The global economy was meticulously managed by European central banks, with the British pound acting as the undisputed anchor of international commerce. But this arrogant, deeply entrenched illusion of eternal supremacy was about to be violently and irreversibly shattered into a million pieces. Beneath the veneer of polite aristocratic diplomacy and royal intermarriages, a toxic web of secret military alliances was quietly being woven. In a span of just 30 years, exactly one human generation, Europe would completely, totally, and permanently lose control of the world. It was not conquered by a foreign, alien invasion from across the oceans, nor was it initially defeated by a massive colonial uprising. Europe essentially committed geopolitical suicide, tearing itself apart in a brutal, unprecedented storm of mechanized, industrialized slaughter. The catastrophic, unrecoverable unraveling began in the fateful, sweltering summer of 1914 with a single, highly consequential political assassination in Sarajevo. The great empires of Europe marched arrogantly into what they foolishly believed would be a short, glorious, and highly decisive conflict. Military commanders confidently promised their eager populations that the victorious troops would absolutely return home before the first leaves fell in autumn. Instead, they walked blindly into the mechanized meat grinder of the First World War, introducing humanity to the absolute horrors of modern trench warfare. The rapid advancement of lethal industrial technology had completely outpaced the archaic Napoleonic tactics utilized by arrogant European generals. Machine guns, poisonous gas, and heavy artillery transformed the lush European countryside into a barren, apocalyptic wasteland of mud and blood. Millions of young European men, the absolute flower of an entire generation, were senselessly slaughtered for mere inches of ruined, muddy ground. But the physical destruction of human lives and fertile land was only the very first catastrophic consequence of the devastating continental conflict. The war demanded an astronomical, mathematically unsustainable amount of capital to produce artillery shells and feed massive, sprawling armies. Modern industrialized warfare operated on a scale of consumption that completely defied the careful economic preparations of every single combatant nation. To finance this unprecedented bloodshed, the proud European empires completely drained their vast, historic, and carefully accumulated sovereign gold reserves. They shipped massive, secret convoys of gold bullion across the treacherous, submarine-infested Atlantic Ocean to pay for vital American munitions. When the physical gold finally ran out, they desperately turned to the printing presses, creating massive amounts of unbacked fiat currency. Governments abandoned the strict, defining discipline of the classical gold standard, sacrificing their long-term economic stability for immediate military survival. This reckless, panicked printing of paper money ignited the destructive, slow-burning fires of severe inflation that would soon ravage the entire continent. And when the printing presses were simply not enough, they began borrowing massive, utterly unpayable sums of money from across the Atlantic Ocean. They turned to the rapidly industrializing, officially neutral United States of America, transferring immense, unparalleled wealth to Wall Street bankers. The British and French governments effectively mortgaged the future of their entire global empires to secure the massive loans necessary to continue fighting. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the European continent was fundamentally, structurally, and permanently changed forever. The sheer scale of the devastation was unimaginable, leaving a deep psychological scar that completely broke the optimistic spirit of the Victorian era. For ancient, massive empires, the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman had completely collapsed into dust, chaos, and violent political revolution. The Russian Empire was entirely consumed by a brutal Bolshevik revolution, resulting in the execution of the Tsar and the birth of the Soviet Union. The German Empire was forcefully dismantled and replaced by a fragile, economically crippled republic that was forced to shoulder the entire blame for the conflict. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was violently shattered into a dozen fractured, unstable nation-states, erasing centuries of Habsburg imperial consolidation overnight. The victorious nations, particularly Great Britain and France, were technically triumphant but structurally, morally, and completely financially ruined. The once mighty British Empire, which had proudly financed global industrial development for a century, emerged from the war as a heavily indebted, exhausted nation. They were now heavily indebted to the United States, irrevocably transferring the ultimate center of global financial power from London to New York. Wall Street emerged from the choking smoke of the First World War as the new, undisputed creditor and financial dictator of the civilized world. The profound psychological trauma of the endless, muddy trenches had also permanently shattered the European myth of moral and cultural superiority. Colonial subjects from India to Africa had fought and bled in the freezing European mud alongside their supposedly invincible imperial masters. They had witnessed firsthand that their supposedly enlightened European overlords were just as capable of barbaric, senseless savagery as any other civilization. Hundreds of thousands of colonial troops returned to their distant homelands, carrying a dangerous new perspective on the physical vulnerabilities of their oppressors. This profound realization sparked the first, powerful, and unquenchable flames of modern nationalism and fierce anti-colonial resistance across the globe. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, did not create a lasting, stable global peace, but a deeply flawed, punitive, and fragile pause. The victorious Allied powers imposed crushing, mathematically impossible financial reparations upon the defeated, starving German nation. These highly punitive economic measures were specifically designed to keep Germany permanently weak, but they only succeeded in breeding intense, radicalized resentment. The turbulent interwar period of the 1920s and 30s was characterized by severe economic instability, hyperinflation, and rising political extremism. European nations struggled desperately to rebuild their shattered domestic economies while simultaneously trying to service their massive, crushing foreign war debts. In Weimar Germany, the sheer, crushing burden of unpayable reparations triggered one of the most catastrophic hyperinflationary spirals in human history. The German mark became completely, laughably worthless, forcing desperate citizens to use massive wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. The catastrophic Great Depression, originating in the United States in 1929, ruthlessly crossed the ocean and completely devastated the fragile European recovery. American banks, desperate for immediate liquidity, aggressively called in the short-term loans they had extended to Europe, instantly collapsing the continental financial system. Desperate, severely impoverished populations entirely lost all faith in traditional democratic institutions and the rapidly broken promises of free market capitalism. This widespread, agonizing economic despair provided the perfect, highly fertile breeding ground for the rapid rise of violent, totalitarian ideologies. Moderate politicians were violently swept aside by charismatic demagogues who offered simplistic, radical solutions to highly complex economic disasters. Fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany aggressively promised to instantly restore lost national pride and economic stability through brute military force. They militarized their entire societies, completely ignoring the fragile treaties of the past, and began aggressively preparing for a new, even more devastating conflict. Meanwhile, the exhausted, heavily indebted British and French empires were dangerously overextended, frantically trying to maintain control over restive, rebellious colonies. They simply lacked the military strength, the domestic political will, and the essential financial resources to heavily police their massive, sprawling global holdings. The stage was perfectly, tragically set for the absolute final act of European global dominance, driven by unresolved hatred and economic collapse. The old world order was already dead. It simply required one more apocalyptic, mechanized war to finally bury the corpse. In September 1939, the deeply unresolved tensions of the First World War violently erupted into the catastrophic Second World War. If the First War severely crippled the great European empires, the Second War completely, permanently, and physically obliterated them from a map. The entire continent was subjected to 6 agonizing years of absolute, unrestricted, and apocalyptic mechanized destruction from the air and the ground. Entire major cities, from Coventry to Dresden, from Warsaw to Berlin, were systematically leveled by relentless, unforgiving strategic bombing campaigns. The advanced industrial base of Europe, the very foundation of its historic global dominance, was reduced to twisted, smoking, radioactive rubble. Millions of innocent civilians were systematically murdered in the most horrific, meticulously mechanized genocide in the entire history of human civilization. When the global conflict finally, mercifully ended in 1945, Europe was a desolate, starving, and fundamentally broken geopolitical wasteland. The shattered continent was completely divided by a metaphorical Iron Curtain, permanently occupied by the massive, heavily armed forces of 2 new superpowers. The United States of America and the Soviet Union now completely, absolutely, and unilaterally dictated the geopolitical reality of the European continent. Great Britain, once the absolute, unchallenged master of a quarter of the globe, was entirely bankrupt, starving, and heavily reliant on American loans. The exhausted government in London faced a stark, undeniable, and deeply humiliating mathematical reality. They could no longer afford to run an empire. In 1947, Britain was reluctantly forced to grant absolute independence to India, the true, shimmering jewel in the imperial crown. The agonizing loss of the massive Indian subcontinent signaled the definitive, inescapable, and highly visible end of British global hegemony. France desperately and violently attempted to hold onto its lucrative, resource-rich colonial possessions in Southeast Asia and across North Africa. But the exhausted, financially ruined French military suffered a humiliating, completely decisive, and world-shocking defeat at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. This strategic colonial disaster was immediately followed by a brutal, deeply unpopular, and ultimately unsuccessful war to retain absolute control of Algeria. Across the vast African continent, a powerful, completely unstoppable wave of rapid decolonization quickly swept away decades of entrenched European rule. Within just 20 years of the war ending, almost every single major European colony had successfully and permanently declared its sovereign independence. The massive, lucrative resource extraction networks that had heavily fueled European economic prosperity for centuries were permanently and violently severed. The global monetary system was entirely rewritten at the Bretton Woods Conference, completely bypassing any meaningful European input or strategic control. The United States dollar officially and permanently replaced the British pound sterling as the undisputed, absolute global reserve currency. To strictly prevent mass starvation and looming communist revolutions, the United States aggressively implemented the massive, historic Marshall Plan. Billions of American dollars poured directly into Western Europe to rebuild their shattered factories and financially stabilize their dying, fragile democracies. This massive economic bailout formally cemented absolute European dependency on American capital, American military protection, and American political leadership. The European nations, deeply recognizing their new, vastly diminished global status, were forced to completely abandon their centuries of bitter, bloody rivalries. They reluctantly began the slow, extremely painful process of economic and political integration that would eventually become the modern European Union. This was not a triumphant, glorious unification of strength, but a desperate, highly necessary alliance of shared weakness and absolute mutual survival. The deep psychological impact of this rapid, total loss of global power was profound, deeply disorienting, and highly traumatic for the European psyche. An entire generation of European citizens had been born into a world where their grand capitals dictated the absolute fate of billions of people. By the time that exact same generation reached old age, their proud nations were heavily reduced to secondary, highly dependent players on the world stage. They watched completely helplessly as powerful policymakers in Washington and Moscow made the ultimate decisions that determined the future of human civilization. The sheer speed and absolute totality of this historic geopolitical transition is completely unparalleled in the annals of recorded human history. The legendary, ancient Roman Empire took several slow, agonizing centuries to naturally decay, violently fracture, and finally collapse into historical ruin. The global European empires essentially committed suicide in a brief, blinding flash of extreme, mechanized, and highly industrialized violence. The absolute fatal flaw of these empires was not a lack of technology or resources, but an absolute, blinding abundance of immense imperial arrogance. They genuinely and foolishly believed they could harness the terrifying destructive power of modern industry without utterly destroying themselves in the brutal process. The First World War was the fatal, completely self-inflicted wound that permanently severed the major financial and demographic arteries of European power. The massive, completely unpayable debts accumulated between 1914 and 1918 structurally broke the back of the entire imperial financial system. The devastating Second World War was simply the final, necessary burial of a continent that was already politically, morally, and economically dead. It physically erased the remaining illusions of grandeur, leaving behind a continent entirely dependent on a foreign, American nuclear security umbrella. The subsequent rapid loss of the overseas colonies was merely the final, inevitable accounting of a bankrupt, exhausted, and completely morally discredited system. European leaders painfully and tragically discovered that imperial power is entirely dependent on the continuous projection of unquestioned financial and military strength. When that underlying financial strength was violently burned away in the trenches and bombed cities, the moral authority to govern vanished permanently with it. The epic story of how Europe lost the world is a definitive, mathematical proof that absolutely no empire is immune to the unforgiving laws of economics. When a powerful nation repeatedly chooses the destructive, hollow glory of total war over the quiet stability of trade, it invariably bankrupts itself. And when the money finally and inevitably runs out, the sprawling empire rapidly, violently, and permanently collapses into the dusty dustbin of history. The tragic European suicide stands as a permanent, echoing warning to any modern superpower that foolishly believes its global dominance is eternal. Global power is not an inherent right granted by divine providence. It is a highly fragile, temporary condition that can be lost in a single generation. It is maintained solely by strict fiscal discipline, diplomatic restraint, and the absolute refusal to engage in financially ruinous, industrialized warfare. The majestic, sprawling palaces of Europe still stand today, but they are no longer the beating heart of global geopolitical authority. They are merely beautiful, silent museums dedicated to an era of absolute dominance that was carelessly thrown away in the mud of Flanders. The financial center of gravity completely shifted across the Atlantic, carrying with it the destiny of the 20th and 21st centuries. London, Paris, and Berlin traded their vast, global empires for a comfortable, subsidized existence under the heavy shadow of American economic hegemony. The intricate golden threads of credit and control that once bound the entire planet to the European continent were permanently severed. In their place, a new, American-led financial architecture was painstakingly constructed, completely locking the old European powers out of the driver's seat. The loss of India, Africa, and Southeast Asia was not just a loss of territory. It was the final, devastating loss of Europe's economic independence. The massive raw materials that fueled the Industrial Revolution were now under the sovereign control of proud, newly independent nations. Europe was forced to adapt to a harsh new reality, competing in a global market without the massive, unfair advantage of an exploited colonial empire. The transition was incredibly painful, marked by decades of political humiliation, currency devaluations, and massive domestic labor strikes. Ultimately, the story of Europe's fall is the ultimate cautionary tale about the sheer, intoxicating danger of unchecked imperial hubris. It proves that no amount of military tradition, cultural pride, or historical prestige can compensate for a completely bankrupt national treasury. The wealth accumulated over centuries of brutal colonial conquest was entirely squandered in just 30 years of senseless, fratricidal conflict. The European continent willingly traded its absolute mastery of the world for millions of simple white crosses in vast, silent military cemeteries. Today, as new superpowers rise and the geopolitical tectonic plates shift once again, the ghosts of the European empires offer a chilling lesson. The line between absolute global supremacy and complete structural irrelevance is terrifyingly thin, measured only in the reckless decisions of arrogant leaders. Once the critical threshold of sovereign debt and military overextension is crossed, the downward spiral of imperial collapse becomes absolutely unstoppable. The world that Europe built was entirely consumed by the very same destructive industrial fires that the continent had proudly ignited. And when the heavy, choking smoke of 2 world wars finally cleared, the architects of that old world order found themselves entirely locked out of the future.